welcome you on behalf of FPRC and this initiative Foreign Policy School. Let me just briefly tell you that this is just a stepping stone to a master's course in international relations with a specialization in Indian foreign. Okay. All aspects of Indian foreign policy will be part of the curriculum and syllabus at the master's, because the Indian foreign policy is one of the major disciplines at the postgraduate level. But all our 2-year 4-semester course will focus on India's foreign policy, whether it is diplomacy, foreign relations, whether it is India's area studies, or whatever, or India in international organization. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of India's relations and policy matters. So this is how we want to begin this, and with the help of, with the contribution of distinguished people like you, I think we will achieve our objective and all that. So with that, I once again thank you for having accepted our invite, and now it's your stage. Now you can go ahead with your address and all.
So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present my views. And I think this is basically, I think, this is such a wide topic. One is always a student. You can never be I mean, that applies to all topics. But para-diplomacy really reiterates the point that, you're a student. You can never really be you can never even be close to being an expert. But what I'm going to try and do in about 30 minutes or 35 minutes or whatever, I will give a sort of backgrounder to, what are the reasons that why in the last few, and maybe in the past 3 decades specifically, why this has become an area of interest, and what are the nuances of para-diplomacy which we need to examine. So also I would like to state at the beginning that the title of the talk is para-diplomacy because that's most commonly used, but there are other references also. So, to this very phenomena, that is, intervention by states or provinces or sub-regional actors in foreign policy, it has also been referred to as constituent diplomacy, as multi-layered diplomacy. So I'll be explaining the reasons why. First of all, there is, some difference. Again, there are these little nuances and intricacies. So to begin with, I think first of all, we need to look at, we need to go back to, the basic debate in international relations about, what specifically what Keohane and I had said about a state-centric world versus a multi-centric world. So when we look at actors other than central governments, playing an important role in foreign policy, we need to look at, because obviously international relations, the focus is on the state. And when we speak about the state, it means the capitals, the federal government, the central governments, and so on. So the first thing which you need to look at is the distinction between a state-centric world and a multi-centric world. Then within that, obviously the subnational actors, they are not like they are governmental actors, but they are also non-central government actors. So that is the starting point. Then when we look at why, the interest has grown in para-diplomacy and constituent diplomacy, it is the two key issues are, one is federalism, that's center-state relations, and why, there are different reasons for states wanting to be proactive. They can be economic, they can be political, they can be cultural. So that's one thing. And the other is obviously in the last about 3 decades, the phenomena of globalization, then technology, diasporas, all these have played an important role in different ways in pushing forward the phenomena of para-diplomacy / constituent diplomacy. Obviously, this also the phenomena, the degree to which states can enter, the subnational actors can play a role in foreign policy is dependent upon the political system as well. Because, in a federal system, the interventions are of a different sort. In a system, in a unitary system, obviously subnational governments don't have that space. So these are just some basic points. Now, the term para-diplomacy actually was used the first time in a chapter in a book called Studies in Diplomatic History and Historiography by Butler. Now, in that, paradiplomacy has been referred to as the highest level of personal and parallel diplomacy, complementing or competing with the regular foreign policy of the minister concerned. It is thus a recurrent temptation to the chief of the executive, be he a premier or president, dictator, or monarch. So this is we often, when we look at paradiplomacy, we look at the 1980s and the 1990s. So obviously the connotation of the term paradiplomacy was very different then, but it has been used in this publication which I mentioned, and this was published in the year 1961, and this is again, I would like to repeat, Studies in Diplomatic History and Historiography. Now, when you look at the whole notion about, as I said, the terms which are used, paradiplomacy, constituent diplomacy. So the term paradiplomacy was first used actually after 1961 in an article titled "The International Dimension of Subnational Governments," that was published in the Journal on Federalism, Publius. The name of the journal is Publius, in the fall 1984 issue. And then, of course, we have had two important books. So one book is Federalism and International Relations, the Role of Subnational Units. This was authored by Michelman and Soltos. And then you have Paradiplomacy in Action, the Foreign Relations of Subnational Governments. Now, coming back to the definitions, as I had said. Now, an agreed definition of paradiplomacy is, a form of, Kuznetsov, in a publication in 2015, defines paradiplomacy as a form of political communication for reaching economic, cultural, and political or any other types of benefits, the core of which consists in self-sustaining actions of regional governments with foreign governmental and non-governmental actors. Now, there is other, this phenomena of subnational actors participating. The debate has been with if one has to look at the debate with regard to the definition of paradiplomacy. So Kincaid, for example, has spoken about constituent diplomacy. So he says that when you use the term paradiplomacy, it can also be either, you can be at cross purposes, or you're ignoring the fact that the constituents, the subnational governments, the states, and so on. For example, in the US, the states have an important role to play. So they cannot, you cannot assume that it is the central governments which are dominant. So that was one part. Then when you look at other arguments, so for instance, Hawking, he has used the term multi-layered diplomacy because he believes that paradiplomacy includes, it sort of overlooks the complexities of diplomacy. So that is why you have come up with, two other references to this phenomenon. Now, so Brian Hawking has argued that as unitary actors, whereas in reality, they represent complex patterns of relationships, both inside and outside the national settings, and embrace a diversity of interests. Now, this complexity is not captured in paradiplomacy according to Hawking. Similarly, when you look at Kincaid, he's raised a question, what to call this activity? Para means alongside of, to one side, aside from, or secondary. Constituent diplomacy captures the idea that states, provinces, cantons, landers, and the like are constituent units of federal polities. So he says that in the United States, for example, the states are co-sovereign constitutional units, not constituent. So this has been the justification for using the term constituent diplomacy. Now, moving on to, moving beyond the definitions, now looking at what are the reasons. So for this, it's important to understand, first of all, the different types of, many a time when you look at intervention by states or provinces, it is that one of the major deficiencies in some of the literature is that it is monolithic. it looks at all these exchanges from one lens. So you have, for instance, there are different types. So for instance, when you look at paradiplomacy, there's trans-border regional paradiplomacy. That is very important. Then you look at global paradiplomacy and you look at paradiplomacy. Now, trans-border regional paradiplomacy, as it seems quite evident, is about, linkages between states and provinces with other states and provinces based on geographical contiguity. So for instance, you can say US states and Canadian provinces, the linkages which they have can come under the classification of trans-border regional paradiplomacy. Similarly, if you look at South Asia, if you share any borders, that sort of paradiplomacy needs to be looked at under this lens. Then of course you have the types of paradiplomacy where you're looking at promoting your own identity, where there's a strong domestic political component. So it's in some cases, so for instance, if you look at Quebec in Canada, if you look at the Catalan region in Spain, there are political reasons, and there are, sometimes the sort of the center and the states or the provinces or the subnational units, they're at loggerheads. So that is an important aspect as well. And then sometimes this paradiplomacy is also used by regional leaders to promote themselves domestically, to increase their political clout. So these are, apart from obviously what we're going to look at now in terms of the, the aspect of, as I said, economic, global, environmental, some of the reasons why this has picked up in recent years. Now, one major push for paradiplomacy is called, it has been, Duchasek has referred to this as Me Tooism. That is mere imitation. So certain non-central governments began establishing contacts of paradiplomatic nature with an eye basically on, not, I would not say imitating, but emulating other subnational actors. So for instance, if you look at the case of, if you look at North America, if you look at non-central governments, they opened representative offices abroad. Now, this was a case of Me Tooism. Now, of course, later on, then there were, when, an analysis was done, whether representative trade offices actually are successful or not. Some were successful, some were not. But it's important to understand this term about me. And even if you look at the case of India now, a lot of, for instance, if you look at first in 1990s and 2000s, it was two or three South Indian states which reached out very aggressively towards the United States during the course of the information technology, what is called the revolution. After that, other states have also started, they began to reach out to the US. Then there was a phase after the 2000s as China grew and as relations for a while had sort of improved to some extent. Numerous Indian states reached out to China. The process was begun by Gujarat, Maharashtra, and a couple of states, but others, then you are to reach out to China. So phenomena it has been referred to as Me Tooism. This is important to understand. Now, the next part is that when we look at paradiplomacy, you also need to look at, if you look at some of the examples, there are some very interesting examples. So for instance, if you look at trade negotiations, the Canadian province of Alberta was very active during negotiations on on the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Similarly, in the context of ties with the US, Alberta has been proactive in sort of reaching out to US governors with regard to specifically to some infrastructural projects pertaining to connectivity between both the countries. So there's, for instance, there is something called the Keystone XL pipeline project. In that, Alberta has been very proactive. Then now, if you look at the United States, what is very interesting is, the group of governors in the US, which has created what is called the United States Climate Alliance. So I think this was endorsed by 30 governors, and this is a bipartisan sort of initiative. And when the US government, this it came up actually after after the Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change. Initially, only 12 governors had joined this, and later on it has grown. And then apart from that, there are mayors also, mayors from a number of cities in the US and other parts of the world who have joined this alliance. Now, what we need to understand is that initially when constituent diplomacy and para-diplomacy began, this was largely or broadly, it was a Western concept. As the economic center has shifted first towards China, and then obviously even over the past 2 decades, India witnessed high rates of economic growth, has a large market, the outside world saw a lot of potential. So China has developed its own sort of model. And this, it's important to understand that the Chinese model of para-diplomacy, because it sort of, it's interesting because normally it's assumed, if you look at the Western literature, it assumes that only, in a democratic setup, which is truly federal, there is scope for this. But China actually, for long, it has allowed its some of its scope. Obviously, now the nature of the para-diplomatic activity is economic, or to some extent it will, and there are agencies within provinces which coordinate between the province and the central government. But there has also been a clear target. So for instance, if you look at the first wave of para-diplomacy in China after the economic reforms, the focus was on coastal states. And so obviously, in this context, it was the province of Guangdong which took the lead. And if you look at Guangdong, Hong Kong economic linkages from 1980s onwards, you can, if you look at the figures, you can see how closely they were integrated. Similarly, if you look at, and there were provinces, after that, there were provinces like Shandong was closely integrated with South Korea. So China had, there was a strategy to it, and first coastal provinces took the lead, then others also began to join in. But the focus was essentially on, to begin with, was on East Asia. Later on, China has also been reaching, if you look at China-US relations, in spite of the tensions, there were sister cities agreements, there have been sister province agreements, and these local engagements have been quite important, and there have been phases. So first in the 1970s, after the opening, after the thaw between both countries, you had sister cities agreements, sister province agreements. Then from the 1980s onwards, economics played a very important role in linking the US states and Chinese provinces. There was also, from the 1990s onwards, this process of governors from US states and Chinese provinces increased. And I think during the Obama administration, there was a formalized mechanism also through which governors from the US governors and governors from China, they actually interacted. That obviously after the Trump administration, there has been a major shift. And obviously, if you look at the nature of relations, there has been a dip. And one of the casualties of this strained ties between the US and China has been para-diplomacy. And you see, what is also interesting is that even after the COVID-19 pandemic and after the rise of tensions, number of US states were actually accepting assistance from China. So for instance, Jack Ma had sent assistance in the state of New York. They welcomed that. But the former US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had warned US governors from a number of states that you need to be careful about this, that this para-diplomacy, constituent diplomacy, these sister city ties, sometimes, China can misuse this. So this is what I would like to say here is that basically now, just to deviate a bit, even the concept of soft power now is no longer, you cannot dehyphenate it from politics. There was a belief in the 1990s that soft power, people-to-people linkages, educational linkages, you can dehyphenate them. That is no longer the case, as the relations have hardened and tensions have increased. And obviously, so para-diplomacy and constituent diplomacy falls under that category as well. And even it's not only in the case of the US, even in the case of Australia, the federal government has come up with a policy where it will be evaluating the agreements signed by Australian states with the Chinese provinces, including an MOU signed by one of the Australian states with China with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is so. But what is interesting is that in spite of being very different political systems, how paradiplomacy and constituent diplomacy for so long did play an important role in China-US relations, in some extent between Australia and China, because they had also started going along the same trajectory. So that is quite interesting. And now specifically, if I were to come to the case of India, India is a very interesting example of how paradiplomacy, constituent diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, because of globalization, because of the rise of coalition politics, because of otherwise, if you look at the union list, foreign policy is very much part of the union list, and in that, even simple things which are unthinkable of, which are happening today, are actually part of the union list. So, for instance, if I were to specifically look at, what does it include? So, union government is competent to legislate on diplomatic, consular, and trade representation, participation in international conferences, entering into treaties and agreements with foreign countries, and implementation of treaties, agreements, and conventions with foreign countries, foreign jurisdiction, and trade and commerce with foreign countries, and import and export. Now, obviously, till date, the final say is with the central government. But then there are cases like, Professor Sabri was saying about, if you look at the case of West Bengal, for instance, and the TISTA agreement, obviously the state has had quite a role. Similarly, if you look at the mid-2000s, at that point of time, the idea of if you look at the bus service between both the Kashmirs, and if you look at other confidence building initiatives, the state government did play an important role. And what is also interesting is that on certain foreign policy issues, it's believed, we always say that coalition politics. But so, for instance, if you look at ties with Bangladesh, even the erstwhile government in Tripura, which was a left government, even that supported the central government's initiatives with Bangladesh because it was in the interest of the state. Similarly, if you look at ties with Pakistan, and you look at bilateral trade, the clamor in Punjab, for instance, with bilateral trade, if you look at issues like the Kartarpur religious corridor. So there are certain issues where there's a consensus, irrespective of the government in the state. Obviously, there will be certain differences, but I think there is, apart from, if you put aside the media narrative, on serious issues, there is consensus. And even if you look, this is clearly one example. So, for instance, if you look at the phase from about 2011 to 2014, there was a Shromani Akali Dal government in Punjab, and there was a UPA government in the center. So if you look at the integrated checkpost which was set up at Atari, so there was a government of a different dispensation. So sometimes I think what we also need to look at in border states is it's not only about coalition politics, it's about a consensus in the state itself, and also broader political agreement between the center and the states in terms of what is the national interest or whatever. So, but the literature often looks at state participation in the context of the the neighborhood in terms of coalition politics. So sometimes that is a bit simplistic. And also I would like to add that it's not always participation by states, even in the context of the neighborhood, is not always obstructionist. It's actually beneficial also at times, especially when you look at economic people-to-people initiatives. And now when you look at even the Act East policy, the role being played by the northeastern states. Now, there is also there is now gradually a degree of sort of institutionalization, which is happening with regard to paradiplomacy. So you have a states division in MEA. The Ministry of Commerce also is working closely with states on issues pertaining to foreign direct investment. So some interesting steps have actually been taken. Earlier also we had what is called branch secretariats. MEA had branch secretariats, and you have the India Trade Promotion Organization was set up in 1977. States also took initiatives, to enhance trade, to draw foreign direct investment directly. But now it has, over the past, I would say that this started off, the start can be the period after 1991. So the 1991 economic reforms, they actually began the trend. It took a few years, but if you look at the late 1990s and you look at the southern Indian states, that was a perfect example of what is now today called competitive federalism, of states actually competing with each other. So two examples clearly of this are Karnataka. The chief minister then was S.M. Krishna, and the erstwhile, the united Andhra Pradesh, led by Chandrababu Naidu at that point of time, that was there. And then when you come to the 2000s, you have this trend of investor summits. So now today, it's not just 3 or 4 states which are highly industrialized or economically which are doing well, but even in Eastern India. So for instance, West Bengal also has investor summits. West Bengal is also reaching out to, earlier it was reaching out before the tensions with China increased. There were quite a few linkages, and Kolkata and Kunming were actually also, there was an agreement, I think, for them as twin cities. So some steps were being taken in that direction. So I think this whole paradiplomatic activity is, in India also needs to be looked at in 3 or 4. So one is the participation by states in the context of ties with the neighbors. Second is the participation of obviously states which are industrialized, reaching out to Southeast Asia, reaching out to East Asia for foreign direct investment. The third now which we need to look at is also how are the states integrating with important policies. So for instance, if you look at the Northeast, it is the Northeastern states are being made stakeholders in what is called the Act East policy, ties with ASEAN countries, ties with East Asia, and even at times, even Australia is included in the Act East policy. So the whole thing is increased. Now the question is, would we see also, so for instance, when you talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, it has a very strong economic component. And some of the initiatives which dovetail with the free and open Indo-Pacific also actually have potential for states, especially some of the coastal states, them becoming stakeholders. And one of the, in fact, the South Indian states have often been saying that they should also be given a greater role in the Act East policy. So I think the Act East policy, the point arises that it should not, obviously the geographical factor is there, and it's for that reason the Northeast is an important player, but because it's a gateway to Southeast Asia, but also based on, if one looks at things like diaspora, South India can play a very important role in the Act East policy, and other states also now can become stakeholders. It depends also on, apart from the geography, it also depends upon air connectivity. It depends upon the economic trajectory of states. Then we have based purely, the paradiplomacy based largely on diaspora. So in that, obviously, you have the blue-collared workers, then you have white-collared. So you need to look at that dimension as well. So if you look at Kerala, for instance, Kerala's role in India's ties with the Gulf, it is very important. If you look at professionals from southern India, from other states, they have also played, they have been ambassadors for the respect, especially in the phase of the 1990s, the diaspora with Andhra origin or of Tamil origin, they have played very important role in terms of assisting the states. It doesn't only have to be specifically FDI is one, but even in terms of enhancing the people-to-people contacts, enhancing awareness, facilitating sister city agreements, and so on. And in recent years, the 2 South Indian states which have played an important role, one is obviously Telangana. They have a ministry in fact, they have a department which specifically deals with these issues, which would come under paradiplomacy, and that's referred to as the Ministry of External Affairs, Department of External Affairs. Similarly, Kerala also has a department which specifically looks at overseas affairs, diaspora, remittances, and all, so that there is greater coordination. But in spite of this, what is needed is, I think, at the end of the day, you need, I think, better coordination is needed between the center and the states. A lot has to do with the domestic trajectory of federalism. And there are, I think what is also needed is that you need more platforms where these issues can be discussed. Because, for instance, when you look at FDI, foreign direct investment, when you look at trade issues, they obviously have a strong domestic component also. So when you look at policies with WTO, for instance, in fact, the central government had urged states also to set up WTO cells. At that point of time, also some of the states were made stakeholders. But you need a clear, there are institutions which exist. They should be used more productively for ensuring that this para-diplomacy is successful. And then, the states on their part also need the Me Tooism as far as attracting investment or having a share in the trade or whatever, that all is fine. But you also need to see that what are your strengths and what are the strengths of the country or the province or state within the country which you're reaching out to. So unlike so certain countries have mapped, they have got clear priorities based on. So for instance, not every state is going to do well in information technology or in pharma. So you can do well in tourism, you can do well in medical tourism, and based on that, you can look at countries which have potential. That is one part. And then the other is also about, if you look at the literature itself also, at times it is stuck in the past. So one is that the fact of the matter is that your border states, obviously there are security considerations, but they can be gateways as well. So now that change has begun, but that that needs to move even forward. That border states can be a gateway. They are not just a zone which is far away from Delhi or a conflict, a region of conflict or whatever. So that is one thing. There has been a change, but further change is needed in that. And then I think now the nature of para-diplomacy is going to change in a post-pandemic world. First of all, there are opportunities now. While you can't travel, I think in a way, states which earlier probably did not have opportunities to reach out to other countries, or they have the opportunity. Then the changing this argument that a number of Chinese companies, they want to shift. So obviously they're looking at India as an opportunity. So some states have tried to look at that dynamic as well. And so I think these are some of the important factors. And now again, after this, the current global disruptions which are going on, I think it's also important that even if a state directly does not have any role to play, for the central government and the state government to seek, both can important foreign policy. Because after all, even if you're not, whether you share a border or whether you have any linkages otherwise in another country, but so for instance, when you look at a foreign policy development and the impact on the economy